Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I step out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Good morning, listeners. I hope that you're having a pleasant day. It is a lovely summer morning here in suburban Chicago. The sun is shining. My neighbors are out messing with their lawns and stuff. It's July 3rd, so we're just about up to Independence Day, and I am out for a walk. This will probably be the last episode I record before I go on my trip, which may or may not work. I'm going to have to see how the math plays out, but I think that I got it figured out so that you won't have a pause in your schedule. If I did it correctly, this episode should be playing, I think, Wednesday the 11th, and then I have an episode queued up for the 13th already, and then I'll be back to my normal recording schedule after that. So, well done me. That's assuming this episode turns out. Maybe it'll be terrible. Oh well. So, today I wanted to talk a little bit about unusual approaches and unusual themes for games. In particular, this is inspired by an event. My wife and I recently celebrated our 17th wedding anniversary, and as our gift to ourselves, and actually it was our main birthday gift also for each of us. We both have birthdays in the spring, and early summer, so we agreed to not buy anything extravagant for either of those, plus our anniversary, and we went to see the musical Hamilton here in Chicago. Oodalolly, it was great. If you haven't, I feel a little old-timey saying this because it seems like everybody was really excited about Hamilton like a year and a half ago, but it's great, really good, incredibly moving. I'd listened to the soundtrack ahead of time, so I knew it was, especially the second half, is pretty sad, but boy, oh boy, I didn't realize how intense it would be. It was quite an exciting experience, and if you get a chance to see it, I do recommend. My daughter's a little jealous because she got into the soundtrack after I started listening to it and was kind of mad that she didn't get to go, but I think it's coming to the Lansing area next year, and so she may be able to go with Grandma and Grandpa. But anyway, it got me thinking a little bit about why. Hamilton is great for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that makes it so compelling is it's such an interesting way to tell the story, right? That it uses modern music, hip-hop style, and non-traditional casting to tell this, what otherwise might be told in a very sort of boring way, this traditional story. But you also don't generally see musicals about history, at least not sort of boring founding father history, I guess. I don't know if there's a American Revolution the musical. I'm sure there is. But it seems to me like telling the story of the life of Alexander Hamilton as a hip-hop musical seemed like an odd choice. And to most people who aren't board game hobbyists, any kind of complicated theme as a board game really seems like an odd choice. People don't understand what board games can do as a creative medium, and so they're often surprised when you're explaining what's going on. I've had a couple times now, particularly in reference to the Prodigals Club, is a really good example of a theme that's just kind of bonkers. Like, wait, you play rich people trying to destroy your own lives because you're bored? Or I really enjoy telling people about Ladies and Gentlemen, which is a cooperative, or it's a team game where you have you play in teams of two, and you have each team of two, one player is a lady, quote unquote, and one player is a gentleman. And the ladies game involves trying to find and acquire the right arrangement of clothes to be able to have the nicest outfit for the ball. And the gentleman game involves this sort of crazy grabbing of tokens and things to try to get things for The gentleman's game involves grabbing tokens and trying to negotiate the sort of marketplace in order to make money so that you can buy the things your wife wants for the ball. It's really, and then there's a negotiation part where you and your partner, who are sitting on opposite sides of the table, have to talk about what you'd like to buy. And the rules say you're not allowed to talk about how much money you actually have. And the wife is not allowed to talk about, like, we need this hat because it's the best score. Like, you have to couch it all in Victorian language. And of course, proper ladies and gentlemen in Victorian England didn't talk about money. So the husband couldn't reveal, like, he made no money in the market and he can't even afford to put anything on hold. He just has to say, no, we're not buying any of this stuff. It's funny. When you get sort of a person you wouldn't think of pleading to buy some earrings or something is funny. It makes the stock market look pretty ridiculous, but the stock market is kind of ridiculous. So I love games that have weird themes. It amuses me greatly to find a game where the theme is confusing or unusual and unexpected. So I love Last Will for that reason, The Prodigal's Club, A Study in Emerald, part of why I like that game. So a game where the theme is really weird. Dungeon Pets is really weird. I love that sort of thing. And given my delight with Hamilton, I thought I would spend today doing a little bit of public brainstorming, thinking about what kinds of things might you do? What kinds of stories might you tell? I was thinking particularly in the context of history, what kind of story might you tell to make an interesting game? What kinds of games might you make? So I had, I had two ideas. First, of things that I know have been made, but I haven't played all of the versions, or the ones I have played are bad. The first one is the Titanic. The Titanic is a sort of pet hobby for me. I'm a bit of a Titaniac, as they say. No one says that really, but I do. It's, this sort of keystone moment in the second decade of the 20th century, kind of metaphor. I mean, The Onion summed it up best. World's largest metaphor hits iceberg and sinks. The idea of all of our ideas about modern achievement rolled up into this one ship, which we hubristically drove across the ocean as fast as we possibly could, and then crashed and sank it. And then, of course, the drama of not having enough lifeboats and the class war that happens, and the human moments and the heroic moments and the cowardly moments. It is both as a storytelling thing and as a historical event, full of detail and really interesting. But I don't know how you make a game of it without cheapening it. There have been a couple games. I've played the board game that was released around the time of the movie, and I haven't played it. I read the rules, and it was so terrible I couldn't bring myself to play it. Perhaps at some point I will, just to have played it, but ugh. I also have the 1970s board game called The Sinking of the Titanic, which has a really interesting tilting thing on the board, but that one is even weirder because the lifeboats have to have supplies in them and make it to islands, which is not at all historical. So I know that there are a couple card games, like there's a solitaire card game based on the Titanic, which sounds kind of fun, but it doesn't seem very thematic. Z. Garcia featured it in an episode of Board Game Blender at some point. But, so I haven't really seen a good Titanic game, and I can't conceive of what it would be. Like, I don't know what... You don't want a game where you can try not to hit the iceberg. That doesn't make any sense. So games about the shipping industry are interesting. I'm really keen to try Transatlantic at some point, because while Concordia is fun, the theme is a non-starter for my family. Nobody in my family will want to play a trading in the Mediterranean game, but I think I could get them interested in transatlantic shipping. So I'm really keen to try that at some point, but I've yet to run across it. But that's not about the Titanic, that's about shipping. So I don't know what you would do in the game Titanic. I mean, it's pretty morbid to have a game where you try to survive. especially because it would mean, someone else not surviving, perhaps. I don't know. I really don't know how you would make that game. But it seems like that is a theme that hasn't been properly explored yet. I also noticed that Tasty Minstrel has released a game called Ponzi, which is about Charles Ponzi and the original Ponzi scheme. I read a biography of Ponzi. What an interesting guy. For those of you who don't know, a Ponzi scheme is where you have an investment scheme and you pay for one person's investment with another person's money. So it makes it appear as though you're making money when really what you're doing is it's a pyramid scheme. Actually, in the language of con artists, they call it a Peter and Paul scheme, because the original one started when the Church of England used money from the Basilica of St. Peter to pay for repairs at the Basilica of St. Paul. They took from Peter and paid Paul. That's where that phrase comes from. So that's what the scheme comes from. But I haven't played Ponzi. That might be a perfect exploration of that idea. I'd be interested to see how that one plays. But I don't know how you play a 4-player game of that unless you're all Ponzi, or else you're just trying to do a Ponzi scheme and get away with it, which isn't really what Ponzi was doing, at least according to this biographer, which was a relatively generous discussion of his life, which basically sort of talked about him as an overambitious salesman who got in over his head. And from that regard, Ponzi would be really interesting to think about. How do you make a story about an overambitious salesman? I don't know. Seems like there's a theme there that I haven't seen done well. So as the Titanic and Ponzi are two sort of historical moments that I thought need a theme, but I haven't really seen games that did it very well. A third one that I think Deadwood Studios, the game from Cheap Ass Games, did this a little bit. And I know that like the video game, the movies started in the early film area, but it feels like the early film industry is a really ripe field in which to plant the germ of a game. Like a meaty, complicated finance game would be really interesting to play, set in the early days of the movie industry, when people were sort of rough and tumble, and people were competing. You'd sign stars, and as I contemplated how would that game work, I started to think, like, is this just remaking The Networks? Which is Gil Hova's excellent game about running sort of cheap TV studios, or cheap TV stations, or TV networks, I guess. But it feels like there could be something different there. There could be a spatial component where you're building your studio, and or your movie studio, and having different kinds of studios allow you to make different kinds of movies and capitalize. It seems like there's something there, which might be worth exploring a bit more as we go along. And I looked a little bit. I didn't see anything in that era. I certainly haven't heard of anything in the last few years. So that seems like a ripe fruit to be plucked as an interesting economic game, and things that people would enjoy. And you also can then have some humor in there with the names of movies, or perhaps you include a whiteboard thing, so when people make films, they name them themselves. That would be interesting. So the movies, the early movie days might be a place. Then there are 3 historical narratives that I think would just be interesting to think about as fodder for games. And again, I don't know how it would work. I really don't. But first off, the women's suffrage movement seems like a really great story to try to tell in a board game, right? That it's a political movement and a social movement, and it's about rallying public opinion and shaping communities. And it's easy to forget that it's barely 100 years, or not even 100 years. See, I don't even know my years on this, but not that long since women got the vote in the United States. And how quickly we forget as a culture, the fights that happened. So it would be interesting to explore that story a bit more think about like how would a game work where you're trying to gain women's suffrage. But then, I mean, it would also sort of beg the question of like, well, it must be a co-op then, right? Because I hope nobody's having to play the anti-suffragists, because that wouldn't be fun. It'd be like, I mean, think about Freedom, the Underground Railroad. You're all playing members of the Underground Railroad. Nobody's playing the slavers. It would have to be the same way, where nobody's playing the anti-suffragists, and then it's a co-op, and maybe there's some things to be learned from these other co-ops, but that one's a little less interesting to me as a story, as a game development mode, but as a potential for how to tell an interesting history story. It seems like women's suffrage has potential there. And then we have my favorite story from World War II. I have at various times listened to a number of different World War II books. I think early in the podcast, I was just finishing listening to Operation Paperclip. I was talking about that. There's an earlier book that I'd gotten called Operation Mincemeat. Operation Mincemeat is fascinating. It's the story of how the Allies tricked the Axis powers by dropping a corpse in the ocean that had a briefcase full of important papers. There was this idea that Hitler would only believe a ruse if we were able to adequately make it feel like he discovered it. And so the Allies actually took a corpse, dressed it up as though it was a courier, chained a briefcase to it, and then faked a plane crash in the ocean off the coast of Spain, where a Nazi sympathizer was in charge of the beach, and they dropped a corpse. And in the end, it turned out that the papers made it all the way to Berlin. That people kept believing them and passing them up the chain, in part because they were found chained to a corpse in the ocean. So, yeah, if you get a chance, go read Operation Mincemeat. It's a fascinating book. Ian Fleming was involved in the plan, of course, being part of Britain's spy network before he went on to write books about being a spy for Britain. Again, I don't know how this would be a game, but Operation Mincemeat feels like fascinating territory. Maybe for a Time Stories type, really heavily narrative game. And then finally, again, this would have to be some sort of co-op done in chapters, but it could also be a kind of Robinson Crusoe style co-op. The story of Ernest Shackleton's experience in the South Pole, which his ship, of course, is called the Endurance. If you don't know the story, it is fascinating. Shackleton led a group of men to go to the South Pole, and their boat got frozen in, and they ended up staying in the Antarctic a really long time, like I think a year and a half. And everything that could go wrong went wrong, but they managed to survive in really incredible ways. And again, it seems like the sort of thing where you could have a board with a bunch of different scenarios, and you play each scenario and you have to try to win the scenario, and then you could have different decks of sort of event cards or different kinds of challenges. It'd be interesting to think about how to make it a game that would be fun to play more than once, as opposed to giving into the kind of legacy style temptations. But thinking about the various ways that people have solved co-op puzzle, sort of Matt Leacock building problems thing, or the solution from Robinson Crusoe, where you have a problem come up and then the choice you make shapes how you'll move in the future. It would have to be really hard to be interesting, but it seems like there's a lot there. I mean, it's such a compelling story. I have to say, from this process of brainstorming a little bit here, I'm really excited about both the early cinema game and the idea of a co-op game about Shackleton. I feel like both of those need a little bit more brainstorming and thinking to see what could become of those. So I'm sure I'll be working on those, and you'll hear my process as I proceed. I'm using the Daniel Salas model, I guess, where I just sort of think out loud in public, and hopefully nobody steals my ideas. We'll see. These are all public domain subjects anyway. There are probably games about all these things currently being worked on as we speak. So, but that's my thinking for the day about weird stories or interesting stories that you could tell. What kinds of stories have you been thinking about for games? What's the most unusual theme that you enjoy out of a game? What's a story you think should be told in a game, but you just haven't figured out how to do it, or maybe you're not a designer and you have no interest in it? Lots of interesting ideas out there to talk about, and I'm keen to hear what you have to say. The best place to post those is on Board Game Geek, Guild 3269, and or pop into Twitter at Rattlebox Games. You could tweet at me or email me, brendan@rattleboxgames.com. Any of those things will work to get a hold of me. If you haven't had an opportunity if you haven't taken the time to review the show, it's always helpful to help us find more listeners. Either put a review on Board Game Geek or perhaps on whatever streaming service you use or whatever downloading service you use to get your podcasts. Maybe iTunes or Spreaker is where our podcast is hosted. So any of that kind of promotion would be welcome, or just tell a friend about the show. A little shout out to Megan, a regular listener who has been promoting us all over the place. It seems like every time I see her post something, she mentions us, and I really appreciate that. It's fun to watch the numbers slowly creep up in the how many people downloaded this episode readout on Spreaker. If you haven't commented yet on the Board Game Geek Guild, pop over and say hi. It'd be fun to hear a little bit more about who's listening, what kinds of games you play. Well, that's it for me today. I just reached home, so I'm going to sign off. Thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Okay, bye-bye.
We rendezvous with Rochambeau, consolidate their gifts.
We can end this war in Yorktown, cut them off at sea, but for this to succeed, there's someone else we need.
I know.
So he knows what to do in the trench, ingenuitive and fluent in French, I mean. So you're gonna have to use him eventually. What's he gonna do on the bench, I mean? No one has more resilience or matches my practical, tactical brilliance. You want to fight for your land back?
I need my right-hand man back.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.